Hey everyone, and welcome to the 20th episode of the Liam McCullum Show. I guess it's somewhat of a small milestone. My first interview was back in January, and I've honestly had much more success in getting interviews than I thought that I would. And I guess it goes to show that people are really willing to talk about things that they're interested in, just if you reach out to them. So today I'm going to be talking to Baylen Linnekin. He is a food lawyer, scholar, and law professor. He is the author of Biting the Hands That Feed Us: How Fewer, Smarter Laws Would Make Our Food System More Sustainable. Linnekin serves on the board of directors of the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund. We're going to be talking about some of his most recent articles from Reason.com regarding the meat shortage that we are seeing in the United States and how certain laws and regulations have been problematic for farmers. Here's the interview.
Thanks, Liam, for having me on. I'm Baylen Linnekin. I'm a food lawyer and author, sometime scholar and law prof, and I think we're talking because I wrote a column for Reason on some meat shortages and regulations that are unfortunately promoting that.
Yeah, and recently there have been a bunch of big processors all across the country that have shut down, and a lot of local farms have been struggling because of this. Do you want to talk maybe a little bit about the Wholesome Meat Act of 1967 and basically certain things that are restricting or some red tape that is causing these farms to struggle?
Sure. So the Wholesome Meat Act of 1967, which took effect, I think, 2 or 3 years after it was passed, Congress delegated to the USDA the authority to regulate intrastate meat sales. So I don't think anyone would disagree that the USDA has the authority under the Constitution to regulate interstate meat sales between, Colorado and Kentucky, let's say. But does the USDA have the authority to regulate within any one state? No, I think that's pretty clear. And unfortunately, Congress delegated to an agency, the USDA, a power that it didn't even have itself. So we've got a constitutional issue right off there. So that's certainly a legal question, and I think still a ripe one. But then we've also got the impact of that, which is not legal necessarily, but economic, and has really reshaped the face of meat and meat processing in this country. So it used to be that there were hundreds, if not thousands, of abattoirs and small processors and whatnot sprinkled around the country, and small farmers would bring their cow, let's say, have it slaughtered and processed and turned into steaks and all that kind of stuff, and then they would sell it. It's the easiest way to do things, probably the most efficient, and it's one that farmers like. Well, the Wholesome Meat Act changed that and said basically that it created a system with 3 different options. So as a farmer, you can contract with one of the large processors, which we've just discussed due to COVID-19 outbreaks at many of these plants around the country. They've been forced to close or dial back their work. So that's sort of the current issue. But you have these USDA inspected plants in about half of the states, and you can sell that meat anywhere, whether it's pork or beef, anything under the Federal Meat Inspection Act. And there's poultry has a separate regulatory scheme. Anyway, so you get your meat processed in a plant in any state that's USDA inspected, and provided it passes inspection, you can sell it anywhere. And that's what the big processors are doing. They're contracting with farmers to, deliver their pigs or cows or whatnot, have them slaughtered and processed. So that's one step. Then there's the state system, which arose after the Wholesome Meat Act of 67, which is the state inspected that are enforcing regulations that are at least equal to federal law. And you can sell those commercially, those cuts of meat, anywhere within a state. So if your cow was born in Colorado, it was raised and slaughtered in Colorado in a state inspected facility, you can sell that meat anywhere in the state. Can't sell it anywhere outside of the state though, unless it's processed. There are a couple exceptions, but for the most part, that's That's the rule. So you've got these two systems. It's strange, and everyone who uses a state-inspected facility questions why this is the case, and I don't have a good answer. But you can raise a cow in Taiwan or Kenya or the Netherlands, and provided that it's inspected according to the rules of the country, and the USDA has inspected and judged that to be an acceptable Sorry, I'm trying to combine practice and process into one word, and it's not working. Provided they find it acceptable, then that, let's say that Dutch or Kenyan or Taiwanese farmer can sell their meat anywhere in the United States. Which, why can't American farmers sell meat across state lines? But, and I have nothing against foreign producers, but I don't think that they should get a leg up on American producers. Let's treat them equally. Right. And so those are the two main inspection regimes, and that's where 3/4 or more of our meat comes from. But then you have these state facilities that aren't inspected, by the USDA or by state inspectors necessarily, and those people are the ones who sell a side of beef, for example. They sell this giant, massive portions, and it's because a consumer. There's now one state that has an exception, but a consumer has to own a share in the living animal. And so, you're buying 25% of a cow while it's still alive. You can only buy Bessie. You can't buy a steak from these small farmers. And that's the problem we have. It was always a bad idea. I talk about this in my book, which came out about 4 years ago, how these local custom slaughter facilities, as they're known, force farmers really just, and it's not the facilities, but the regulations that do this. You can only sell a portion of a cow. You can't sell, let's say you live next door to a grocery store and you're raising cows. You can't sell to that grocery store or to a butcher or to a restaurant or at a farmer's market unless you've gone through either that USDA inspected or that state equal to inspection process. It's a bad idea. It doesn't make sense. And right now, with those facilities being the ones that are really hit hard by COVID-19, it's a terrible process and terrible idea. We have, the smaller farmers are doing pretty well, very well in some cases, because people like me and you can't get meat at our grocery store, and so we're going directly to farmers. More people are discovering who their farmers are, which is nice. But this is something that should have changed a long time ago. You should be able to slaughter an animal that you raised, some local grass-fed beef, and sell it to the co-op down the street. But you can't because the regulatory structure is what it is. So thanks to the Wholesome Meat Act, we have this problem that now has really come to a head due to the coronavirus outbreak, which is that local farmers have the capacity to address some of this issue. Again, they're not, they're a small part of the overall food system, but we're handcuffing them at a time when we need them most.
And now you have another article on the new Wyoming law that actually allows local ranchers to sell directly to consumers. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and whether or not they've had any legal action against them or anything like that?
Sure. Well, the law was passed within the last couple of months, but it doesn't take effect until July 1st, I believe. So there's been no repercussions. The state, from what I hear, is confident that any challenges, which would presumably come from the USDA itself, will be beaten back, let's say. But the basic premise of the law is that, and I explained, you can only buy a share of an animal, a living animal. And up to now, no state has been creative enough to use that, the language of federal law and actually apply it and say, okay, fine, you can buy a portion of a living cow, but you can also get the cuts from it. You can get the steaks and all that stuff. So you don't have to buy half of an animal. You can buy, smaller percentages. And so, they're still figuring out, again, because it doesn't take effect till July, exactly how it's going to work. But from everything I've heard, farmers are really interested. They're at least starting off probably going to devote a portion of their let's say, cattle or hogs to this, to see as a sort of test and see how it goes. But I think it really is a model for what other states can do down the road. But it would be nice if there are now a few efforts to get rid of those sort of restrictive Wholesome Meat Act rules, in which case that would probably neuter the Wyoming law. But I think the law's authors and ranchers everywhere would be happy if they didn't have to have this kind of end around, and they could just, ultimately sell cuts of meat to consumers.
And now you have another article about COVID-19 highlighting harms of bad food regulations. Are there any other regulations other than the Wholesome Meat Act, the ones that are in the Wholesome Meat Act, that you find problematic?
That's the most problematic one, but there are some other things. I think you're referring to the counter article that I wrote probably last week. And, in talking to ranchers, mid-sized ranchers, small ranchers, and processors around the country, there are some issues. For example, they could ramp up productivity if the USDA, would be a little more flexible with their overtime rules. Their inspectors can work up to 40 hours a week for, in a plant, and the plant doesn't have to pay them anything because the law says they have to inspect it. If they want to work 41 hours, then suddenly overtime rules kick in. And it can be really challenging for small producers. That's not on the scope of the sort of broader problems of the Wholesome Meat Act. But there are wastewater regulations, which I talk about, which are challenging for facilities that want to try and ramp up. They're busy, but they might have a little extra capacity that they could fit in. But somehow the wastewater regulations under the EPA say you need like a bigger retaining pond or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so, now if that was ever a good idea to have those regulations in place, now is probably not the time to, with food shortages possible, likely happening in various parts of the country. Let's be flexible, not rigid.
Right. And now you mentioned in that same article that you think that the CARES Act funding should go to small and mid-scale farmers, but the USDA has not opened up that funding. What's up with that? What's the dynamic there?
Yeah, I think I was quoting Judith McGeary from the Farm and Ranch Freedom Alliance in Texas on that one. My understanding is that they're opening up that funding to smaller producers, but I don't know. I'm not a CARES Act expert by any stretch.
Okay. And then you were also mentioning that I think it was another quote that inspectors were going to these plants and it could actually make COVID-19 much worse, or the outbreak much worse. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So there's these plants, particularly the big ones. We're talking about places with hundreds or even thousands of employees working elbow to elbow on these mechanized lines. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that type of facility. They feed a lot of people, and they, generally feed a lot of people with cheap food, which at a time like this is good. So again, nothing inherently wrong with those facilities, but if you throw in foodborne illness, which certainly happens at these plants from time to time and causes massive recalls, that's an issue. But now, with people working in such close proximity to each other in these plants, and I just saw a headline, I think 3 state outbreaks. I want to say there's Missouri and a couple other states that are right now really seeing as at a time when cases in some states are declining or evening out. These states aren't, and they've traced this sort of increase in COVID-19 cases in those states directly to 3 or more meat plants in these states. And so, that's a huge problem. Basically, you have 2 different types of systems. The big plants have usually permanent USDA inspectors on site. So let's say Tyson or whomever, they have 1 or more inspectors always on site at their plant. That person, they arrive at work in the morning and they leave in the evening, and they've been at that plant the whole day. So that's the big plants. The more mid-sized plants, which goes directly to your question about these roving inspectors. smaller plants might have one inspector who, shows up from 9 to 12 and then goes to a different plant 2 hours away and is there from 2 to 5 or something like that. And there's, again, nothing inherently wrong with the roving inspector, but during a time of coronavirus, where even at the mid-sized plants, you've got these, got these heightened outbreak risks. Now you add these roving inspectors who, may be perfectly healthy, but who may, as we know, it's easy to be asymptomatic. But you've got these inspectors who visit one plant and then drive 100 miles away, visit another plant. And that's unfortunately an ideal way to spread the coronavirus. And so both of these plant types, are facing incredible challenges right now. And it's another reason that, the small producers who use the local custom plant with only a few employees, it's just, they can't feed everyone, but they can probably do it more safely for consumers and at this point, certainly for workers.
Right. And now the focus has been on meat processors and stuff like that just within the last couple of weeks. But is there any other part of the food market that you find troubling? Certainly restaurants are number one, right? It's even the ones that that are doing okay by some standards are really struggling right now. People, for the most part, in the majority of states, can't go to a restaurant. And so they've become these sort of takeout places. And, for a place that is, let's say, McDonald's or, your local taco joint or some food truck or something like that, it's, their business has taken a huge hit, but it's also not that outside of their business model. They're familiar with, walk-up customers, drive-throughs, things like that. Where, the restaurants are really struggling, obviously, is in, fine dining and just places that, are used to making their money on the restaurant industry has, notoriously slight margins. They're making money on people drinking alcohol in their bars and restaurants. And high-end dining, no one's getting foie gras to go. Maybe they are. But, for the most part, people aren't, getting haute cuisine to go. And, I live in Seattle. There are some great restaurants up the street here. They're offering discount meals just to try to keep their employees getting a paycheck. And so, I definitely feel for them as much as I do the farmers who are struggling. But everyone's struggling. I mean, it's not just food, obviously, but then it's also, the alcohol industry in some respects is doing great just because we're all drinking more than we used to. And strangely, people have gravitated back towards beer. Beer was in decline for a long time, and people have sort of rediscovered. Can I swear? Sure.
Yeah, I've rediscovered shitty beers like Bud Light, and craft brewers aren't doing as well as they were, just because people are sort of minding their dollars. But it's everyone's having a rough time in the food industry, I've extolled the virtues of cities, states, and even the federal government when they've rolled back rules to try to make life easier for these businesses, which we need, and we need to be around so that when people do get back to work, they have a place to go, and people like me and you have places to go to hang out in a restaurant or at a beer garden or something like that.
Right. I was wondering, have you been following the Prime Act? And if so, do you support it?
Yes, yeah. So I talk about it a lot in my book, and I'm a longtime supporter. The Prime Act is, and my latest Reason column, I think, from Saturday talks about this. So Prime Act is one of three ways that the Wholesome Meat Act could be improved dramatically. And before I explain exactly how, I'll just talk about the three different methods. So there's the Prime Act, which is a bill in Congress that's got bipartisan support, and it's been kicking around for, I think, at least 5, 6 years. There's also the USDA, which could theoretically roll back Wholesome Meat Act regulations all on its own. It's questionable legality, but plenty of agencies have been doing that sort of thing lately. And even under President Obama, agencies rolled back rules that they didn't like, or that were outdated, or on issues like immigration, things like that. So that's another way. And then Congress also could act in a different way rather than passing the Prime Act, which would be to suspend, amend, or repeal the intrastate portions of the Wholesome Meat Act. So which brings me now to, what's the purpose of these changes? Basically to allow these local custom slaughter plants and the ranchers that use them and the meat that comes out of them to be sold to places like grocery stores, restaurants, at farmers markets, all that kind of stuff. As we discussed earlier, the Wholesome Meat Act doesn't allow that. And the Prime Act, which is sponsored by initially and originally by Reps Pingree, who's a Democrat and an organic farmer who lives on an island off Maine, and then Thomas Massey, who's a conservative, libertarian leaning, let's say, rancher in Kentucky. And so they co-sponsored this, and it would allow, just as the other things I suggested would, these meats to be sold. They're processed at custom processors just by the laws of each state. And, some states could have stricter regulations and put inspectors in all these plants, and other states, might not. But, it's that sort of state laboratory thing. But, states, at approximately half of the states already have state inspectors in plants. And so this would not be some completely out of the blue, how do we do this and all that. States have been regulating meat sales within their borders for, since there were states, and before that even.
There is a big concern, I think, from the people who are against the Prime Act just about the safety of farm to consumer. Is there a legitimate concern there? Or do farms have a way of regulating themselves, I guess?
I think there's always going to be one bad apple, but I don't think that one bad apple out of a million spoils the whole bunch. I don't really subscribe to that. So, we can look at things like the Food Freedom Act in Wyoming, for example, which has been in place for 5 years now, more than 5 years. And that deregulated a lot of intrastate food sales, although not meat, because of the Wholesome Meat Act. The USDA threatened the state just as they did with Maine, which has a similar law, and said, if you're allowing meat sales from uninspected facilities, then we're going to yank our authority for you to basically sell any meat, which would be a death knell for ranchers. So I think that and I was on Justin Peterson's radio show yesterday. He was a libertarian, I guess, candidate for the presidential, and lost to Gary Johnson in the last election. But I was on his show yesterday, and he said, "How do you, similar question? How do you change the Wholesome, Meat Act? It says wholesome right in there. Don't we want wholesome meat?" And of course, it's tough to change the Save the Children Act or something like that, but I just said, well, my idea is the more Wholesome Meat Act, or Wholesomer Meat Act. I think that food safety issues, as I mentioned before, are far more common at the larger plants than they are at the smaller plants. And even if they weren't, the impact of some recall from a plant that's processing millions of pounds of, let's say, beef versus one that's processing 500 pounds of beef is very obvious. It's more people are going to get sick from the large plant than from the small one if there is some sort of E. coli or salmonella issues. And so there's the scale issue, which automatically means that the smaller is safer in that regard, just because it's not going to sicken as many people. And Wyoming has had zero outbreaks, zero cases tied to its Food Freedom Act in 5 years. And before that, food safety advocates were gassed. Oh, this is going to kill people. You're going to kill people. And I don't know where those people are today, but I'd love to have a Zoom or a Skype with them and say, listen, you predicted dire consequences, and really it's only been good. The state's food economy is in a much better place than it was, and people have freedom to innovate, to be creative, to partner up with their neighbors, and to feed their neighbors. And I just don't see how there's a downside to that. And if there is, then please show me the data that tells me this, because otherwise it's just idle threats and chicken little, sky is falling kind of stuff that just isn't true.
Just to kind of change topics a little bit, you do have one article about immigration restrictions, and I think a lot of people would be interested to hear what your position is on that and how it can actually cause shortages.
Yeah, so this was, I think, right before COVID-19 really took root. But as you probably know, and as others may know too, immigrants, they're the people working in our meat plants. They're the people who are planting and picking our produce. They're doing incredibly vital work, and that's all they want to do. They want to come here and work. They'd love to stay home in Mexico or wherever it is they're from, but the economy is simply better here, and the demand for their labor is here as well. And so immigration restrictions are stupid, period. But immigration restrictions during this pandemic, when I'm not going to go out and pick vegetables in the field. I'm just not. It's it's a lovely, I have a little garden on my patio here, and that's pretty much all the planting and picking I'll do. And I've had an organic garden plot for probably 9 of the last 10 years, and I love gardening and all that. But I'm not going to work in a field. That's hard work that most Americans, me included, are unwilling to do. And we need labor from people who are willing and able to work, and those most often are immigrants. And so, again, all immigration restrictions are stupid. As long as people are coming in through border checkpoint, and they show some document, and they're here to work and to enjoy the freedoms that Americans enjoy, which are perhaps withering away as we speak, but that's a separate thing. But yeah, I mean, that can cause a dramatic food shortage. And I've heard from farmers in California, which grows the majority of our nation's food and also produces most of our beer and our wine and all sorts of other foods, that they don't know, how they need to plant crops, because in 1 month or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or however long the crop in question takes to grow, they need to pick that. Mm-hmm. And if it doesn't get planted, it doesn't get picked, and then it doesn't reach you and me in the grocery store. And so these problems that we're seeing now with meat in terms of shortages could also happen in other sectors if we decide that the visa program that allows workers to come here, if that's not embraced as a way to regulate immigration while also feeding all of us.
And now, just to kind of finish up here, do you want to talk a little bit about the Keep Food Legal nonprofit? It was the first food freedom nonprofit.
Yeah, we were incredibly successful in every way except the fundraising portion of things, which it turns out to run a nonprofit, you actually need some money. But I founded this about, I don't know, I guess almost 10 years ago, something like that. And it existed for about 5 years. And the premise was that everyone has a right to food freedom, which is the right to grow, raise, produce, buy, sell, share, cook, eat, and drink the foods of their own choosing. And I think that's a constitutional right. And I've written some scholarly articles on this topic and also touch on it in my book. The idea is that you have a right to feed yourself, I have a right to feed myself, and we have a right to engage in commerce around food. which is not an absolute right in the same way that, you can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater. So, there can be regulations, there can be sensible restrictions on that right, but it is a right. And so I argue that, people have a right to, let's see, foie gras I mentioned before is very controversial. It's the fattened liver of a duck or a goose, and it's a French delicacy, which is also popular in this country, and it's been banned by California and some New York City most recently. So that's one controversial food. Staying in New York City, soda, taxes, bans, things like that, we oppose those. And then raw milk and all the other sort of farm type issues. We did not advocate for any particular diet. I'm not a nutritionist. I think you should eat what you want or what your doctor thinks you should eat or what your cultural or family or other practices indicate. There's no one right way to eat. And even if there was, then choice would still be a wonderful thing, because if you don't want to eat the right way, then you should be free not to. Right. So that was the group. That was what we advocated, and I'd still be doing it today if I was any good at fundraising.
Well, if you want to just pitch your book, you've mentioned it a few times, and then tell people where they can find you, we can let you go.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So you can get my book, Biting the Hands That Feed Us, How Fewer, Smarter Laws Would Make Our Food System More Sustainable, at Amazon, your local bookseller, and almost anywhere there. You can get it directly from my publisher, Island Press, if you'd like. They're the nation's largest enviro publisher. So you can do that. And otherwise, you can find me at BaylenLinnekin.com. I write a weekly column for Reason magazine. I have for 7 or 8 years. You can find me there. And I guess that's about that. Can I ask you a question?
Yes,
before we go? So I'm guessing you're like possibly in like the bedroom that you was yours when you were a kid or something like that.
I am home. Yes, this is actually the computer room, but I am home from college.
Yeah, how is that? That's got to be a weird time.
It's been incredibly interesting. The transition from being in my apartment every single day to having to deal with my younger brothers and my parents and all the tasks around the house, it's been really weird. And not really knowing whether or not I'll be back in school next fall, also very strange. But I've found that it's been a really interesting time to actually be able to have these interviews. I have more freedom to do that. But yeah, it's been interesting.
Yeah, no, it's I feel for you. I mean, I'm as you may have guessed, I'm older than college age, and so but I remember not so long ago, I guess my times in college, and I can't imagine having to deal with what you're having to deal with. The idea of having to move home and just have your sort of college up in the it's up in the air, I guess, right? It's like you might be online, you're in Bozeman, I think, right?
I was in Missoula.
Missoula, okay. And you just, well, I don't need to tell you about the uncertainty, but I feel for you, and I think it's cool that you're doing these podcasts, and I enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming on.
Cool. Thanks. Shoot me a link when it's up, would you?
Yeah, I will.
All right. Thanks. Cheers.
It's the weekend and we can let go. It's the full send, it's the get-go. It's the get-go, get-go. Still not as green as a bank account screen on.